He left me with $12.47 and a cruel note demanding a clean break, leaving me financially ruined. But what neither of us knew was that my deceased father had left me a secret worth over $1 million. The silence was the first thing that hit me. Not the peaceful, early morning quiet I was used to, but a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all sides. My husband, Mark, was an early riser. The smell of brewing coffee was usually my alarm clock. But that morning, the house was still and cold. The coffee machine on the counter was dark. On the kitchen island, where he usually left a funny doodle for our son, Leo, there was only a single stark white envelope with my name, Sarah, written in his neat clinical handwriting. My heart started a frantic drum solo against my ribs. I knew, even before I touched the crisp paper, that my life was about to split into a before and an after. The note was short, brutal, and devoid of any of the love he'd promised me for 12 years. He wasn't happy. He hadn't been for a long time. He'd met someone else, a woman from his office named Tiffany, and they were starting a new life together. He wrote that he needed a clean break. He hoped one day I would understand. A clean break. The phrase echoed in the cavernous silence of my empty house. I sank onto a kitchen stool, the note trembling in my hand. A clean break. What did that even mean? I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I opened our banking app. My stomach twisted into a knot of pure ice. The joint checking account, $12.47. The joint savings, the one we'd painstakingly built for a down payment on a bigger house, the one that held our dreams, 0.0. I frantically logged into Leo's college fund account, the one we'd started the day he was born, empty, wiped clean. A hysterical sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped my lips. He hadn't just left me. He had financially obliterated me. I was a stay-at-home mom. I'd given up my career as a graphic designer to raise our son, a decision we'd made together, a decision he had sworn was for the best. Now I had no income, no savings, and a mortgage payment due in a week. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crawl up my throat. I looked around the beautiful home he had left me in, and all I could see were ticking time bombs. The electricity bill, the water bill, the grocery list on the fridge that now seemed like a cruel joke. For 2 days, I existed in a fog. I went through the motions for Leo, making him peanut butter sandwiches I could barely afford and plastering a smile on my face that felt like a cheap, cracking mask. At night, after he was asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table and just stare into the darkness. The zeros from the bank app burned onto the back of my eyelids. I was adrift in a sea of despair with no land in sight. Then, on the third night, as I was rummaging through a box of old keepsakes looking for, I don't even know what, my fingers brushed against worn leather. It was my dad's old wallet. He'd passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and my mom had given it to me. I'd never had the heart to go through it. I opened it. The familiar scent of him, a mix of old spice and sawdust filling my senses. Tucked into a hidden flap behind his driver's license was a single pristine debit card. Taped to it was a small folded piece of paper. In his familiar shaky script, he'd written, "For a real emergency, sweetheart. When you have nowhere else to turn, pin is my birthday. Love, Dad." Tears streamed down my face, blurring his words. This was it. This was a real emergency. This was the absolute last resort he had envisioned for me. I felt a surge of guilt, of shame for failing so spectacularly that I had to turn to this, but it was overshadowed by a desperate flicker of hope. He was a retired carpenter. He wasn't wealthy, But maybe, just maybe, there was a couple of $100 in there. Enough for groceries, enough to keep the lights on for one more month while I figured out what to do. The next morning, with Leo safely at school, I drove to the nearest branch of my dad's old credit union. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I felt like a thief using something that wasn't mine, even though he had left it for me. I couldn't bring myself to face a teller, to explain the situation. The shame was too much. Instead, I walked on shaking legs to the outdoor ATM, the little card feeling like a lead weight in my hand. I took a deep breath, the cool morning air doing nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird in my chest. I slid the card into the slot. It beeped and asked for the PIN, my dad's birthday, 0815. My fingers hovered over the keypad. This was it. Please, I prayed to anyone who was listening, just let there be enough. I closed my eyes and pressed the final key. The machine whirred for what felt like an eternity. On the screen, the options appeared: withdraw, deposit, check, balance. My finger, trembling, pressed, check, balance. The screen flickered. A new page loaded, and I saw the number. My brain refused to process it at first. It had to be a mistake, an error in the system. I squinted, leaning closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a mistake. There, under available balance, was a number so large, so impossible, that the world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. A 1, followed by a comma, then a 2, a 5, a 0, another comma, and then 3 more zeros after that. My vision swam. The sounds of the street traffic faded into a dull roar. All I could see were those digits, glowing on the screen, mocking the ruin of my life. I stood there, clutching the cold metal of the machine for support, unable to move, unable to breathe. I froze. A car horn blared behind me, jolting me back to reality. I was just standing there, a statue of disbelief, holding up the line for the ATM. My hand, acting of its own accord, stabbed at the cancel button. The machine dutifully spat my dad's card back out. I snatched it, my fingers numb, and almost ran back to my car, fumbling with the keys. I locked the doors and sank into the driver's seat, my chest heaving. $1.25 million. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Carpenters don't just have $1 million stashed away in a secret account. My father was a man of simple pleasures. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup. His idea of a fancy dinner was the steakhouse on the highway, and his most prized possession was a collection of well-worn woodworking tools. I drove home in a daze, the world outside my windshield a muted, blurry film. The pristine balance slip I'd printed out sat on the passenger seat, a glowing beacon of impossibility. Back in the suffocating silence of my house, I placed the slip on the kitchen island next to Mark's cruel farewell note. The contrast was dizzying. On one side, the complete destruction of my life. On the other, a salvation so immense it felt like a hallucination. Was this some kind of cosmic joke? I spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated paralysis. I couldn't touch the money. I couldn't even think about it. It felt wrong, forbidden. It wasn't just a gift from my dad, it was a secret he had kept from everyone, including my mother. Why? Where had it come from? The questions circled in my head like vultures. My dad was the most honest man I'd ever known. The idea of him having that kind of money, obtained in any way that wasn't strictly above board, felt like a betrayal of his entire memory. That evening, after I'd put a bewildered Leo to bed, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. I went to my parents' old room, which I'd kept mostly as a guest room since Mom moved into her condo. In the back of my dad's closet, behind a stack of old flannel shirts that still smelled faintly of him, was a small, heavy metal lockbox. I'd always known it was there, but he'd always said it just held old army papers and his birth certificate. I found the key in its usual spot, hidden in an old shoe. With trembling hands, I carried the box to the bed and opened it. There were no army papers. Instead, there was a neat stack of bank statements for the account, dating back 5 years. I leafed through them, my heart pounding. Small, regular deposits of a few $100s for the first couple of years. Then, 2.5 years ago, just 6 months before he died, there was a single massive wire transfer, $1,250,000. The memo line contained only a string of numbers and a single word: settlement. Settlement? A settlement for what? An injury. He'd never mentioned a lawsuit. He'd never been in an accident that I knew of. Beneath the statements was a thick manila envelope. Inside was a birth certificate, but it wasn't his. The name was one I'd never seen before, Daniel Rosales, but the date of birth was the same as my father's. And then I saw the parents' names, and my blood ran cold. The mother's name was unfamiliar, but the father's name was my grandfather's. My dad had a brother, or a half-brother, a secret brother I never knew existed. My mind was reeling, struggling to piece together this impossible puzzle. A secret account, a secret settlement, a secret brother. My entire life, the entire image I had of my simple, honest father was a lie. Tucked at the very bottom of the box was one last thing: a small, tarnished silver key, the kind used for a safety deposit box. Taped to it was another one of his handwritten notes, smaller and more frantic than the last. It consisted of only 7 words, but they hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the last of the air from my lungs. Don't trust anyone, especially not your mother. The words on the note felt like a brand on my skin. Don't trust your mother. It was an insane, impossible command. My mother was my rock, my confidant, the one who held me together after Dad died. The thought that she could be part of this web of secrets, that my father felt the need to warn me against her, was more devastating than Mark's betrayal. It fractured the very foundation of my world. I couldn't just let it go. I needed the truth, no matter how ugly. The next morning, I drove to my mother's condo. The lockbox and its contents were in a tote bag on the passenger seat, feeling heavier with every mile. When she opened the door, her face was a mask of concern. "Sarah, honey, you look like you've seen a ghost." I walked past her into the living room and placed the birth certificate and the bank statement on her polished coffee table. I said nothing, just watched her. She looked down, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly at the name Daniel Rosales. A flicker of something fear, regret. A memory long buried crossed her face before she smoothed it over. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. "That's what I came to ask you, Mom," I said, my own voice dangerously quiet. I pulled out the final note, the one with the tarnished key, and laid it on top of the pile. Her eyes scanned the words my father had written, and the color drained from her face. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally broke. A shuddering sob escaped her, and she collapsed onto the sofa. And then the whole story came pouring out. My grandfather, a man I'd only known as a benevolent, smiling figure in old photographs, had had an affair decades ago. Daniel was the result. The family, driven by my grandmother's iron will and shame, had forced the other woman away and cut the child out of their lives completely. But my father had never forgotten. He'd spent years secretly searching for his half-brother, consumed by guilt. He finally found him when Daniel was a grown man, working construction. They'd only known each other for a few short years before a horrific scaffolding collapse at a non-union job site took Daniel's life. My father, as his only acknowledged next of kin, had sued the company for negligence. He'd won. The $1.25 million wasn't a windfall. It was restitution. It was blood money in his eyes. And it had torn my parents apart in his final years. My mother, practical and terrified of their dwindling retirement funds, had seen the money as a godsend. She'd begged him to use it to buy a smaller house, to travel, to finally relax. But to my father, spending a single dollar of it felt like dancing on his brother's grave. It was a secret, shameful memorial, not an inheritance. His warning to me wasn't about malice. It was about a fundamental, heartbreaking disagreement. He was afraid she would convince me to treat the money lightly, to not understand the weight of the life it represented. After her confession, we sat in silence for a long time, two women mourning men they had lost in different ways. Then together, we drove to the bank. The safety deposit box was in an old downtown branch with marble floors that echoed with every step. The clerk led us into the vault and I used the small silver key. The box was light. Inside, there wasn't gold or bonds or more cash. There was just a single faded photograph of two young men with their arms around each other, squinting in the sun. They had the same smile. My father and his brother, Daniel. Beneath it was a letter addressed to me in my dad's familiar hand. He wrote about his guilt, his regret, and the profound, brief joy of finding his brother. He explained that he could never touch the money himself, but he couldn't bring himself to give it away either, so he'd saved it. "This isn't blood money, Sarah," he wrote, the ink slightly blurred as if from a fallen tear. "It's a second chance. His, and now yours. I've seen the man Mark is, even if you can't. When the time comes that you need a clean break of your own, use this. Don't just survive. Live. Live for yourself. Live for Leo. Live enough for the both of us." Tears streamed down my face as I read the last line. It was permission. It was an apology. It was the purest form of a father's love. I finally understood. The money wasn't a burden. It was a shield. It was a future. It was my dad's last gift to me, ensuring that no man could ever leave me with nothing again. I walked out of that bank and into the bright sunlight, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The heavy, suffocating silence that had started my nightmare was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. That afternoon, I transferred enough money into a new account in my name to be secure. Then, I picked up the phone and called the best divorce attorney in the city. When her assistant asked what the call was regarding, I smiled. It was the first real smile in what felt like a lifetime. "Tell her," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm calling about a clean break.